You may have heard about Universal Windows Platform applications, also known as UWP applications, and you may have wondered what they are. In this video, I'm going to introduce the topic of UWP and show you how to get started building your own applications using this framework. Along the way, we'll talk about when you would build a UWP application, what pitfalls to avoid, and how to get up to speed faster. Now, if this is your first video you watched of mine, my name is Tim Corey, and it's my goal to make learning C# easier. One of the ways I do that is by teaching context. There are a lot of tutorials out there that teach you what to do. I go a few steps beyond that to show you when to do it, why you should or shouldn't do it, what pitfalls to avoid, and what the best practices are. Basically, I get you ready for the real world. If that's the type of training you're interested in, subscribe to my channel and hit the little bell icon to be notified when I release new videos. Finally, in the description, there are links to get the source code for this video, to sign up for my mailing list, to join Patreon, and to get access to all my courses, as well as all the other links that I'll mention in today's video. If you're looking at a career out of C#, or if you want to be better in your C# career, my content can launch you forward faster. Check out all I have to offer at IAmTimCorey.com or sign up for my mailing list to hear from me directly. Okay, let's go over to Visual Studio. Now, before we get started, I do want to show you about an extension that's free for Visual Studio that we're going to use today. So let's go to the Extensions menu and Manage Extensions. Now, I'm using Visual Studio 2019. I'm using Enterprise Edition, but it doesn't matter. You can use the free Community Edition. Again, it's free. Just go to visualstudio.com and download it. And it's going to work exactly the same as what I'm showing you today with my version. Now, I've already installed it, but if you were to search here when you're online, notice the Online tab on the left. If you were to search, you're going to find the Windows Template Studio. So search for Windows Template Studio. You'll find that and install it. Normally, I don't focus on extensions, and I don't use extensions primarily in my development. And instead, what I do is I try and use just the basic what Visual Studio has built into it. However, in this case, this is actually a really big deal. When you're just getting started with UWP, this is the way to go, because this will give you examples of how you do various things in UWP. It's a really big help. So definitely install the Windows Template Studio. Again, you don't have to if you really don't want to. However, this is going to give you the examples you need to get started faster. So with that, let's go to our File menu and look at the Start window. I'm going to create a new project. I'm going to create a UWP project. All right. So Windows Template Studio Universal Windows. It's a new one that's installed. I just installed that template. So if you want to search for it, you could, but it's Windows Template Studio. We're going to use this to create our UWP application. Again, Universal Windows Platform. Now we're going to talk about what UWP is, where it goes in just a minute. But first, let's hit Next. And we're going to call this our Demo UWP application, or Demo UWP, and then Demo UWP app. All right, just have a different name for our solution versus our project. We'll hit Create. And once this starts, it's going to refresh the templates, which is good. And then this is our wizard to get started on building a UWP application. Now, in order to make some of these decisions, we need to talk through where does UWP fit in the C# ecosystem? Where do we install it? Where does it run? And so I'm going to bring up a web page, and I'll link this down in the description. This web page here is what is UWP, Universal Windows Platform. Where does it go? And here at the top, this graphic kind of shows you it can install on small things like IoT devices or Internet of Things devices, mobile, which phones pretty much not anymore because of the fact that the Windows Mobile is pretty much done. But PC, Xbox, Surface Hub, even HoloLens are potential deployment spots for this application. So when it says Universal Windows Platform, Universal makes it sound like it will go anywhere, but that's why the next word is there, Windows. So Universal Windows Platform. This is not a cross-platform device in this application in the sense that it can go to Mac or Linux. It can't. It lives on any device that runs Windows. All right. So you got the Xbox, you got PC. Those are the big ones. Surface Hub is a smaller market, and so is HoloLens. Even IoT is not really huge, but it's a possibility for your deployment areas. So I'll link to this. You can read through all that UWP does. One of the big things it talks about is creating secure apps. So it really sandboxes the app. What that means is that you have limited access to the PC directly. You usually go through APIs. The benefit there is that it can be a little more secure. You can have to ask for what you need, just like a mobile app does on your iPhone or Android, where it says, I want access to your photos. Do you allow that? You can do the same thing with your UWP apps. The downside is that if you're used to working on Windows with, say, WPF or WinForms, where you have direct access to Windows, like the file system and everything else, it can be a little restricting. Now, those restrictions can be good, but there can be some hurdles to overcome as well as you're building your application. You have to figure out if it's a good thing for your application or not. Now, some of these benefits have kind of gone away from being exclusive. So, for example, UWP apps are available in the Microsoft Store. Now that we have the ability to put WinForms and WPF applications in the Windows Store, that's not an exclusive thing for UWP apps, but it is something you can do, is put your app into the Windows Store. Now, one of the other limitations of UWP is it can only run on Windows 10. And even more restrictive is going to be which versions of Windows 10 we allow it to run on. It's not every version, unless you specify that. And we'll talk through this in a little bit when we talk through how do you specify those versions. But essentially what happens is you get to choose which installation or which version of UWP or which version of Windows do you want this app to run on. And by doing that, you limit which APIs you have access to. Because as the versions of Windows have progressed, they have given more and more access to our UWP applications. But if a person has the older version of Windows, they wouldn't have those APIs. Therefore, you couldn't use them if you're going to allow your application to run on that, possibly. And we'll talk through how to do that. And that's the next tab over, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Now, the upsides are we do have access to a bunch of Windows 10 features like live tiles, push notification, user activities, with interactive timeline, Cortana, a whole bunch of other things. So there is a lot to work with when it comes to Windows 10. And since Windows 10 is becoming more universal, it's a growing marketplace that you have access to. So depending on if you are working independently or working with a small company, or if you're working with an enterprise, this may change your perspective on UWP. A large enterprise that has not yet moved to Windows 10, UWP is not the right choice. Or where a lot of the customers at large enterprise are not Windows 10 yet, that's probably not the right choice. However, a large enterprise that has moved all their PCs over to a certain version of Windows 10, it's a great option because now you have access to those APIs and those additional features that Windows 10 brings in. And since Windows 10 is one of the only Windows versions that still support it, I believe Windows 7 is going out of support. I'm not positive when that is going to happen. But with that, you should have more reach. Now, not everybody follows the support guidelines of Microsoft. So you have to know your customer base to know whether or not this will work for you. Now, in general, UWP is going to be a desktop application, just like WPF or WinForms. It's just it has access to those APIs. It does have access to be installed on other platforms, such as the Xbox or HoloLens or an IoT device. So there are other options here, but in general, it's a desktop application. So that's enough theory, let's look at this menu builder to figure out how to build our first UWP application. And this is a really, really helpful menu. This is something that comes with that extension. If you had just done a file new project and said a new UWP project, you get a blank project that does not look much different than a WPF project. But you'd be sitting there wondering, how do I use this? Well, with this, it's going to set up for us a demo project. Now, you could use this as your actual project, but I would encourage you to use this as a demo, understand it, and then build it yourself with just the pieces that you need. That will get you more familiar with the actual UWP, and it will give you just what you need for your application. So on the left here are our major categories we're going to go through in our configuration in this wizard. In the center section, this is the information about the specific category we've selected, in this case, project type. On the right is our current project's details, all of them. And so you can actually make some changes over here if we wanted to. But for right now, what we're going to do is follow this navigation by first selecting which project type we want. Do you want a blank project, a horizontal navigation, a vertical navigation on the left, or you want a menu bar? I want the navigation pane on the left. That's the standard option, and it's one I think that will work well for us. So from there, I could hit the next button, or I could click over here on the next navigation category. Either way. And now it's going to ask us, what type of pattern do you want to use? Notice under design pattern right now, on the right, it has selected code behind. And that's also what's selected here. So this on the right, this reflects what we've already selected. Now, code behind is where you put the code right behind your form. If you've worked at all with me with anything WPF, you've seen that I really like the MVVM framework pattern, especially the Caliburn Micro implementation of that MVVM framework. The really cool thing is that this offers you 4 different MVVM patterns. So MVVM is a standard design structure pattern, and then these 4 frameworks add on top of MVVM or make MVVM easier for us. And so we have MVVM Lite, Basic, Prism, and Caliburn Micro. And so with just a click of my mouse, I have now changed the design pattern for this application to be Caliburn Micro, and my application, my UWP application, will be set up to use Caliburn Micro. Now I have that pattern in place. I can look at how it's set up and how it's different from a WPF application, or just start using it, and it makes that initial configuration a whole lot easier. So there's my design pattern. I hit next. And now I have, what pages do I want? I already have a blank page. Notice the 1 here. I believe that's the main page. But then I can scroll down here and I can see a whole bunch of other pages I can add. What these are example pages. So these are for you to see how would I set up a settings page, for example. So I hit the plus button here. And now notice there's a settings page right here that's now been added to my project. A web view, which renders a web page. Notice the details here. If you click this, it's going to talk more about what this does. So it's going to build a web content using Microsoft Edge. All right, which I should be. Microsoft Edge has switched over now. I'm not sure if you caught this. It uses the Chromium engine. So it's actually essentially very, very similar to Chrome on your PC. And so it's going to use that Chromium engine in your UWP application. So if you wanted that, we could do that. We'll leave that off. We are going to do a master detail. That's kind of important. And just to kind of see it, let's also do a content grid. The really cool thing here is it's going to put in for us some sample content to show us what it would look like. So down here, data grid. Yep, sounds good. You could add the Telerik data grid as well. I'm going to use the standard built-in data grid. Chart, I'll skip that for now. Map, I'll skip that. Camera, I'll skip that. But it would show you how to use your webcam. Image gallery, ink for drawing, smart canvas, and picture drawing. So if you were interested in having any of these things be added to your application, you just mouse over it and click the plus button next to the one you want. Notice camera is there now. But maybe I come over here and go, oops, I didn't want camera after all. On the right hand side, I can mouse over to camera, hit the red remove X next to it, and it's gone. I can also rename these different pages if I wanted to. Since this is a sample application, I just want to see how it works. It doesn't really matter what they're named. I think that's pretty clearly named: master detail, content grid, and data grid. So I know what each of those things are and can refer back to them later when I want to actually build the real things. So those are the pages I can add. And there's quite a few samples here. And so that should cover the majority of the things you want to do just out of the box. Hit next. Okay, now we have features. So we can have analytics using the App Center analytics. We can also add other things like deep linking. This can be a link that takes the user directly to a part of your application. And so it's essentially the concept there is, think of a link as being to your website. Okay, so you go to IAmTimCorey.com, that's the link. A deep link might be to one specific course on IAmTimCorey. It's a similar concept with our application, where we can link directly into the application, into a spot inside, not just the start of the application. All right. User activity, you can add that to the timeline for Windows. If you want to allow multiple instances of your application, traditionally a UWP application starts only one instance. And then if you want to click the link, you go to that instance. You don't open up a new version of it. But you can allow multiple instances. There's even some advanced options there as well. And then we also have things like, do you want suspend and resume? Do you want multiple views? Some people like to have the idea of multiple pop-ups or multiple different windows open at the same time. That's a possibility. Settings storage, just help store your settings. That's already installed. Notice that, the features. And then down here we can have background tasks. This can be a share source or a share target. So for example, if it's a share source, maybe you can, if you have a document open in your application, you can click a share button and it can say, okay, where do you want to send this? And it might be to some like email or something else. You can share it out somewhere. A share target means that if you're in your email, you can say share this with. Your application might be one of the ones in the list. So there's some options there. We're not going to get into these advanced features. I just want to show you that they're here. As well as toast notifications. You want to add pop-ups? No problem. We can do that. Azure notifications, Dev Center notifications, live tile. This is in Windows. If you hit the start bar, you can have a tile there that actually changes values and shows different things. You can have that for your application. What's new prompt? So if you want to add that so that when a user first starts your application, it pops up and says, hey, there's something new. Let me show you what's going on. Drag and drop ability and all the rest. We're going to leave these all off. Theme selections is added. That's kind of a fun one that's in settings, so we're going to leave that added. We're going to hit next, and then we get the data. And this is another question that often gets asked is, how do I add data to X? Whether X be WinForms or WPF or ASP.NET Core Razor pages or whatever else, the question is all, how do I add data? Now, there's a few different ways that they offer. I'm not totally in love with the SQL Server data because of the fact that they offer entity framework, and I traditionally find that people aren't as careful with entity framework as necessary, and so it can actually cause some performance issues even in smaller applications. So I'd prefer not to go down that road, but they do have the option of Web API, which is interesting. It's going to add a ASP.NET Core application with an example controller for a HTTP service. So we're going to set up a separate application, add in, so we know how to connect our UWP application to a Web API. That's pretty cool. All right. Also HTTP data service, and we have the XAML style configure. We're not going to do any of these options, but I just want to show that they're there. Again, we're going to try and keep this as simple as possible. I can't show you everything about UWP. This is an intro video, not a comprehensive video. Otherwise, we'd be here for hours and hours and hours. But I'm going to try and keep us focused on a basic UWP app and what to expect. You can come in here and try these different things out. And that's, again, the beauty of this wizard is that you can try something else out. You can even add this stuff in later. And so if you build an application, say, oh, you know what? I want to add in a sample web API. You can come back to this menu, add it in, and it's going to add to your existing project. So there's possibilities here for you to learn even more just by reading the code of what they have done in their example. So that's all the services we're going to add. We hit next. Testing. Testing is a big deal, and you really should be testing your applications because using testing, it allows you to find the problems before they get to production instead of waiting and letting your users find them for you. And so Microsoft really wants to enable or help you test your application. So it says, okay, here's some different test suites you can add. For example, you want to add test. Do you want to test your application with MS Test? You can just hit the plus. How about with XUnit? I prefer XUnit. I hit the plus there. You can also test your core library with MS Test, with NUnit, or with XUnit. So what's the difference here? Well, the app is your front-end application, where the core library is that supporting class library. So create a test project for each. So I added both of those just to show you. We're not going to actually get into too much work with that XUnit. I just wanted to show you that it's really easy to add our XUnit tests with just a couple of clicks of a button. So now we've got this whole thing configured. We can go back through and look and make sure it has everything you want. If we forgot a page, we can go back to Pages. We can find the page you want. We can click Add, and now that page is added. We can even add a page more than once. So Master Detail, we can add 2 of them and just give them different names. In this case, I think we're all set with our pages, with our features, our services, our tests, and everything. So I'm going to hit Create. What this is going to do is build out our UWP application with a number of different solutions to support it, and it's going to configure all the different settings so you can get up and running right away and see how to use these various bits in UWP. This may take a little bit of time. If you notice in the lower left-hand corner, there's a bunch of NuGet packages and other things that are happening as it's building out our application. This is not a simple project right now. It's a little more complex. But with this, we'll have the examples we need to get up and running quickly. All right, so that was real time. I didn't pause the video or anything. That was real time building out our application. Now, I do have a faster computer, so it may be that yours goes a little slower. Okay. Now, it did just lock my computer up temporarily, so I'm waiting for that to kind of come back. But once it does, then our application should be ready to go. Now, if you notice on the right, while we're waiting for my computer to unlock, you'll notice we have the demo UWP, which is our main project. But then we have our core, which is our library, where we have helpers, models, and services. It also has a README file. We can see more information about what that core file has in it. Then we have 2 different XUnit projects, one for our core and one for our main application. And it looks like now we have our application back. So let's start diving into what we have here. So we have our multiple projects. Let's look first at our main project. So this is our demo UWP application. Let's shrink down the rest of these. This is our front-end user interface project. And this is the one that we're focused on building. There's a lot of support to it, but this is what we're building. So we have our views folder. Notice we're using the Caliburn micro style. So we have our views, view models, and we don't have a models folder because it's actually in core. All right. So we have our views and we have our view models. So every view model should correspond to a view with the same name. So for example, let's look at the data grid view model. All right, so we can open this up, and this is our data grid view model. Not a lot to it, but we're doing a little bit of sample data load. Notice the to-do here replaces with your actual data, but with sample data service, we can get some sample data to get started. And then if you come down here to our data grid, we're actually using the syntax of data grid page, not data grid view, which I'm not a huge fan of, but I understand, I guess. It's a little different in UWP. So our data grid page, so there's our page for us, and it's now trying to display, and it can't quite yet because it's not been built yet. So it's still trying to render our page for us. Give it a minute and it should build. And in fact, we can even run a build which will restore some projects and hopefully get us going. Notice the green bar at the bottom here. So if you see this here where it says, hey, go ahead and build in order to see this, go ahead and build in order to see this. All right, so let's look at the XAML while we're here. So we've got a pretty standard stuff. The XAML for UWP is very, very similar to the XAML for WPF, but it's not the same. There are some subtle differences. And that's one of my frustrations, I guess, is that the XAML over different platforms is different. So XAML for UWP is a little bit different than the XAML for Xamarin, which is a little bit different than the XAML for UWP. There's reasons for it. I'm not negating that. There's definitely reasons for it, but it can be a little frustrating because there's just enough differences to cause a little bit of friction. All right, so just note that if you have XAML for your UWP application, it may not just copy and paste over into your WPF application. All right, but it's getting very close. So you have our grid here. In our grid, we have a data grid, and we're not going to auto-generate our columns, and we've got our columns generated manually. So here's our manual columns and our binding. So it's binding to order ID, order date, and so on. All right, that's really all we have here. Let's zoom out on our page. There's not much to go on here. Now you got to zoom in a little bit because that's just ridiculously small. If you notice the very top here, and we can continue to zoom in, there's our different columns. Of course, they're empty because there's nothing here. But notice in the upper left-hand corner, this says 13.5-inch Surface Book, 3,000 by 2,000. What this is showing for us is what's the layout going to look like if we have the horizontal or landscaped version of a Surface Book. We can change this and say, what is it going to look like on a 42-inch Xbox, which is 1920 by 1080 with a 200% scale? It's going to look pretty similar because the fact that we're zoomed in at 100%. But there's some things that will be different. So, for example, a 12-inch tablet in vertical mode might look a little different. So let's zoom this back out so you can see it. In fact, let's do this. Let's collapse our XAML. So it looks like that versus that, okay? And then, of course, this is a simple example. There's not a lot on the page, but some pages, let's see if we can get a better page. Probably not in our designer view, but if we put some sample data here, it would show a little bit different layouts we can play with. But just note that this is here, and it will show you different versions. Now, it does have things like 6-inch phone, but I don't believe there's any 6-inch phones you can deploy to anymore because of the fact that the Windows Phone is no longer a thing. All right, so mainly designed for desktop devices, but you can do these different layouts and figure out how it's going to look in those different renderings. All right, so this is our pages. This is our view models. We do have some styling here. We have strings. So this is our resource file. The really cool thing here is since we have a resource file, we can actually add different translations to our application. It's how we do localization for our application. Right now, this is the resource file for English US. And so we have our name of the thing. So for example, settings_about.txt. That's the name of the thing that we're displaying. And the value in English is going to be about this application. If you create another one of these files and create it for, let's just say, Spanish, you'd have the same name here, but the value would be about this application in Spanish, which I don't know what that is, but I'm sure that a lot of my audience does, because it seems like a lot of people speak two languages. I don't. I'm sorry. But this would allow you to translate your application, or at least have your application render different values depending on which locale you are in, which locale your computer says you're in. So you can change this and see the different versions for the different languages. All right. So this is a demonstration of how to use this file, and then you can just add more languages to this, or more localization to this. All right. Services. There's different services here, and theme selector, activation service, and all the rest. Helpers. So there's a lot of code in here that this is setting storage extensions, and it allows us to, it shows you how to use setting storage to store your settings locally. All right. You can almost copy and paste, if not just use this code in your own application. And so all this just kind of works. All right. You should understand it before you just put it in your application, but there's not a lot of code here. But at the same time, this code is code that you would have had to have written. But because Microsoft has these examples for us, we can just see how to use this. We can understand how it's working, and we can just use it in our application, which is a whole lot easier than trying to write this by hand. All right. So let's do this. We're going to hit run, and notice there's a drop down on the run button where we have local machine, simulator, remote machine, and device. So here's our 4 options for running this. If you're familiar with a web application, let's just pick a ASP.NET Core web application. Typically we have either to run on IS Express or to run on what's called Kestrel, which is that kind of command prompt type window. All right. In this is a very similar concept. It's just we have different options. So a simulator, what's going to do is going to basically pop up an application that's going to run or pretend that it's a full Windows machine. And that's going to install your application on it and run your application. I've had some problems getting a simulator to actually run on my machine. I'm not sure if it's a configuration issue or if it's an installation issue or what, but it's been having some problems running on my machine. I'm not going to use that. Local machine is where we actually install this application on my machine. It's going to be in the start menu and everything, and then it will run it locally. Remote machine is something very similar, but it's going to run on a different machine than the one I'm on. And then device means that it's going to run on a connected device. So let's just say you had an IoT device, you plug it in your computer, and you could deploy to that device and run it on the device itself. All right. So in general, you'll run on your local machine. And that's the default option, but just know those other options are there. So by pressing local machine, this is going to run on my machine. So we're going to run this and see what it looks like. The first time, this may take a little bit of time because of the fact that it's not only building it, but it's deploying it to our machine. But there we go. So now we have a fully working and running application on my machine. Now, the icons are a little messed up, so that's a problem. I think it has to do with where it's pointing to the icons, but it's still usable. So that's our main page, which remember that main page is blank. Then we have master detail. Click on that. This is a master detail page. Notice there's a bunch of sample data here. So you have our master information in the middle, and then the details about that information on the right. So right now we have company A selected. But if I selected company F, the information on the right changes with company F's information. That's a pretty standard master detail page that you might see in a line of business application. Then we have content grid, which content grid has a grid of essentially looks like icons or tiles from Windows. You click on one of those tiles and it expands out. So now you have the full information. Now the tricky bit here, and the thing that took me a little bit to find, and maybe it's just me, but the question you may ask is, well, how do I get back to that content grid? I could click on content grid and that works. That seems a little clunky. Well, in the upper left-hand corner, there's a back button. If you click on that, it's going to take you back to where you were, back again, take you back to where you were, and so on, back as far as you want. Essentially, it's like the back button on a browser. I would personally move that into a more prominent position or give it a little bit more coloring or something to indicate that this is what's happening. Probably what I'd do is I'd move this off the menu and put it right above or right to the left of main so that you would see that it's associated with whatever's down here in this main grid area. All right, so that's just a personal preference, but that's built right in. Also notice there's a little bit of fun stuff going on. Notice when I mouse over, it may be a little hard to see on your screen, but it highlights or changes the color of this box just a little bit, and it highlights or puts a gray bar around it. Also note, I'm not sure you can see this or not, but right now my mouse is pretty much in the center of 4 different tiles. Well, there's actually a darker gray line that follows my mouse, and it kind of surrounds those 4 tiles right now. And it's just those little subtle details that they've put in this application to make it a little bit more alive, a little bit less just flat and dead and unresponsive. So just little things like that that help. Also note when I click on this, it doesn't just blink and it's open. It actually kind of makes it look like it expands out of the button. So you click on this, and the button kind of drops down and it opens up, and it kind of pops in a little bit more of a fun way, or a way that's not just boom, it appears. These subtle things can be really powerful if used correctly, because what it does, it gives your application a little bit more life, a little bit more real feeling to it, versus the cold, stark, open, close, no real interaction. They can also be a pain to work with. So the cool thing is, now that you have this application, you can look at how they did that movement, and you can just basically emulate it in your own application if you want to. All right, so that's the content grid. Find a data grid. This is a pretty popular one. People like to see a data grid in action. Well, there's a data grid. All right, and we can even double click and make a modification. So you can say company ABC instead of A. We can change the date. We can change the time if you wanted to. Let's make that 1999 and so on. So you can make some modifications to this grid. Again, even here, let's open up a little more. There's some symbols. So you can see symbols. You can see the order amount, the symbol for it, the status. Pretty much it's a grid, okay? But it's a pretty common thing that people want to see is this display of information on a page. Well, there's your example for how to do it. Now, the lower left-hand corner, there's a settings button. You click that, and it allows you to do one thing at this point, but it does indicate or show to you how to have settings. In this case, we've got the personalization. We can choose a light theme, a dark theme, or the Windows default. So if I chose the dark theme, notice my entire application just went black. And so now I have this different contrast than I was having before. If you don't like that, you can choose the light theme, or you can set it at Windows default, which in my case is still the light theme. All right, you also have the version of this application, about, which is version 1.0.0.0, and some settings, placeholder text, and some privacy information. So this is a very, very standard line of business application example. This is not a real application, as you hopefully know. So don't just modify this to have your details in it, but it is a good place to start from because we have examples of all these different things. Now, one of the things I can't show you because I don't have my start menu on my recording screen, but right now, there's an application installed on my PC, and it's called Demo UWP. It's in my Start menu. So I mouse down there. I'm going to go ahead and open that up. And now my application starts. So this is separate from debugging. Notice that it's not started, but my application is running. I have master detail and all the rest because it actually installed the full application on my computer. So if you want it off there, you have to uninstall it. But notice when I said that local machine, that's what it did. It installed it on the local machine. All right. Also notice I get to choose which version of CPU to use. x86, x64, that's 64-bit, that's 32-bit, or ARM64 or ARM. So you do have some options there. All right. So you do want to know what you're targeting. If you're targeting an IoT device, you'd probably, I believe, use the ARM or ARM64. Whereas a desktop, you're probably going to target the 64-bit, maybe 32-bit, but probably not. Okay, so that's the main project. We're going to get back to that in just a minute, but let's look at what else is installed just so we can see what this provides for us. So we have our unit tests, and these are tests that are for this main application. If you go to tests, here's some examples of some tests. So we have here a new content grid view model. And what it's doing is it's creating a new view model without the view, just a view model. And that's part of the benefit of MVVM is we can test the code behind our view by just testing the actual view model. All right, they're separate. They're disconnected. Does not need to be a view in order to have a view model class instantiated. And because of that, we can actually pass in a couple of mocked objects, which have the navigation and connected animation service. And then we can actually do some type of testing on our view model instance. Now in this case, they're testing to make sure the instance has been created. That's a really a trivial test or a non-test. But what it does, it gives you the pattern to do to say, okay, now I want to test if I pass something into a method in my view model, does it return the value I expect it to, or something along that nature. You can do a lot of testing on your VM. So with this, they've given you examples of how to do testing on every single view model they provide, including one that has to have some mocked services, since it asks for things that you really don't want to have as part of your unit testing. All right. So with all this set up, all you need to do is figure out how to test, let's just say, the data grid view model. Does it store information properly? Does it process information properly? Does it return information properly? And that's what your tests would test for. Again, I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole too deeply on unit testing in this video, because that's not the point of this video. But in future videos, we probably will go deeper into how we test our view models and how we test our UWP applications in general. So this is a good example, though, to get started. With this, we're testing our core project. And so there's some setups here. Again, not great tests, because it's just saying, hey, is it not empty? But instead, we can actually do some testing on our, in this case, sample data service. So again, there's that example for you to follow when you're doing testing. So let's close all of these. And now let's go over to our core, which is our class library. If we right click and go to properties here, we'll see that this is a .NET Standard 2.0 class library. And in here we have our models, for example, our sample company, sample order, and sample order detail. We have our services, which is our sample data service, essentially just creating some dummy data for us to work with in order to display those data grids and other things. And we have our README that talks through what this is and why you would use it. Not a lot of information here, but it kind of points you in the right direction about what to put in this library. All right, so there's a couple of helpers in here that can be helpful as well. Here are JSON to object async and stringify an object as well, and how to do that well using asynchronous patterns. So all this comes down to really a great example of how to set up a UWP project. One more thing I want to show you before we go and look at what it would be if we didn't use this. Let's right-click on our UWP project and go to Properties. One thing that's very important in here under Properties is this Application tab. And down here we have Targeting. And we're targeting Universal Windows. This is a UWP application. Because of that, we have two targets. We have our target version, we have our min version. And these are the versions of Windows that you will support. Let's start with the min version first. This is the minimum version of Windows you have to have on the client machine before this application will run. All right? You might be tempted to set it to just Windows 10, which is the very first build of Windows 10. And after that, there are other builds. However, the farther back you go, the more APIs that may be missing that you may want to use. For example, using the ink control. We saw there's 3 different pages we could have added for inking. Drawing on a screen, essentially, or other types of drawing with our project. Well, ink was not added with the original Windows 10. So if you had a page that was based upon using ink, and you allowed the very first installation of Windows 10 to install this, and someone did that, then you'd have a page that would not work. And what you have to do is you have to know that that page might not work because it's going to use APIs that are before the version that had our ink. So what you have to do is have some kind of graceful fallback. And I'll look at that. But this minimum version is the one where you say, this is the line in the sand. You cannot be older than this in order to use this application. It just won't work. So if you have something that's critical to your process, where you say, you know what, this application is a drawing application. If you can't use inking, then you can't use my application because it just won't work. There's no point to it. Then what I'd do is I'd set that minimum version to wherever ink was enabled. And I believe it was somewhere around here. So, and I'll show you how to find out specifically in just a minute. But that'd be your minimum version. Your target version, this is the version where you're saying, this is what I want the APIs to be available for. So when you set a target version, what you're saying is, this is the version I want to use for all my APIs. And so if you choose an older version, I'm going to have 2 target versions here. You have to install the SDKs for other versions. But if I chose an older version and it says, okay, well, you know what? First I have to reload. I'm not going to do that. But if I chose that older version, what it's going to do is say, okay, then you can't use any API after this point. Okay? Therefore, I'm not going to allow you to even try it for design time. Now, minimum version means you could be using APIs that don't meet the minimum version and it won't have any problems at design time. At runtime, it might. But with the target version, it's going to say at design time, I'm not going to allow you to use these API versions. So let's look at the different versions for our targeting. So here's our UWP versions. I'll again link this down in the description. So this talks about what each version brought in. So down here, it's the creator update version number 1703 that brought in ink analysis. Windows Ink came in the anniversary update, which was version 1607. So you went back to our application. If I said has to be 1607, kind of went off the page there, 1607 or later, then that would allow inking. All right. So with this, you get to choose which things you want to enable. The later you go, the more stuff that's available to you. However, the other side of it is you're also locking out or limiting your client base, because not everyone installs the Windows updates. especially organizations or enterprises. They may hold off on installing the latest version until they've tested it. And that testing may take weeks, or it may take months, or it may even be they just don't deploy it at all. In which case, if your application targets something later than what they allow, your application will not work, or at least parts of it won't, depending if you chose the minimum version or the target version. All right? So just know what is available here. And if you have a client or if your enterprise says, we are currently on 1703, that means certain things. And one of the things it means is you can't use console UWP apps, you can't use Fluent Design or machine learning or XAML islands and so on. So the later you go, the more stuff you have, but the smaller your client base may become. The perfect world theory here is that everyone has their Windows updates turned on and they're updating their machines. The reality is that's not the case. And so you have to know that and know your audience in order to know what your target and minimum version should be. Now, I talked about the idea that your minimum version can be below some of the stuff you're using. So you may be using, let's just use this as an example. Maybe you're using XAML islands, and that's in 1903, but your minimum version is all the way down here at the very first Windows version, Windows 10 version. So in theory, since anybody that has Windows 10 can install your application, a person that has Windows 10 with no updates could install your application. But you wanted to use XAML islands. Well, what you would need to do is you would need to first do a check to see, can I use XAML islands? And if not, you have to have a graceful fallback or a notification that says you can't use this page or this feature because you don't have the latest version of Windows 10 installed. All right, but how do you do those checks? Well, this link right here, which again is down in the description, this allows you to do some runtime API checks. All right, and here's how you might do it. So here's an example code. So if API information is enum format or enum name value present, is this input scope name value present, which is chat without emoji? If it is, then you can enable that. Otherwise, you're just going to do the standard chat. That's the fallback if chat without emoji is not an option because you don't have it installed, because it was brought in version 1607 of the Windows 10 update. Okay, so there's an example of how you do that fallback. All right, and there's some more examples down here as well. Here's how you might do that. Here's how you might give a message to the user saying, hey, we can't do that because you don't have the latest version. So there's a lot of different examples in here. I won't get into all of them, but there's a lot of good stuff in here showing you how to get around some of these things, because you will have to work through these scenarios if you're going to work with UWP. Because, again, you're working in that sandbox environment, you have to have an API available to you in order to use it. And you might not have it available if you're on a or a version of Windows that doesn't yet enable that API. All right, so that's just something to think through when you're setting your target and minimum versions. In a perfect world, you would set both of these to the very latest version of Windows. But it's not a perfect world. All right, so you have to figure out what you can permit with fallback and what is kind of line in the sand. We can't go below this version. All right, and of course, the versions of Windows are going to change over time, which means there's new versions coming out. And with those new versions will be new options. And so in order to enable those options, you will change your target version to that later version, but maybe leave your minimum version where it's at. But then you again have to have that fallback, or you would change your minimum version as well, which may mean that clients that used to use your application no longer can. And if you're thinking this is a bit complex and you just want to get an application working, I totally get that, because there's a lot to learn to get started in UWP. Now, If you're building small applications, you're building demo applications, you're building stuff for a small shop where you have a lot of control, then most of the stuff you don't have to worry about. Set your target version at the latest version of Windows, and you're good to go. Just use all the APIs you have available to you. It's when you get into using this in production, especially in enterprise environment, or where you have a distribution system like the Windows Store, where you have to start thinking about that. If you only allow the latest version of Windows and you try and put in the store and sell this application, you're limiting your customer base to only those who have the latest version of Windows. That might not be an ideal scenario. All right, so again, you have to make some choices here. Now, when I just mentioned the store, but there are other options besides the store now with later versions of Windows, and it is the very newer versions of Windows. I believe this came out in November of 2019. It now, by default, we have side loading turned on for our PCs. Let's talk through what that is. I've opened my settings dialog here, and in my settings dialog, if you select Update and Security, and then come down here to For Developers, there are a couple options in here. Use developer features, and right here we can allow side loading of apps, which allows you to install UWP applications without going through the Windows Store. Or developer mode, which allows any signed and trusted app and use advanced development features, which means I can install right from Visual Studio and run a UWP application. Before, again, I think it was November 2019, this radio button was checked. Only install apps from the Windows Store or Microsoft Store. What that meant is that if you gave a user your UWP application and say, run this, they couldn't. Not until they changed to allow side loading of applications. So even if you had an MSIX installer or similar installer for your UWP application, you had to go through the window or the Microsoft Store unless the user had side loading turned on. Now, from November 2019 on, this is checked by default, the side loading apps, allowing that. And then in an upcoming version of Windows that should be out in the probably the first or second quarter of 2020, this is going to go away and it's going to be just a checkbox for developer mode, I believe. And that should be on by default. And so what it's going to do is it's going to allow you to install UWP applications without having to go through the Microsoft Store. One quick note, it may not be on by default, the developer mode, but it's going to allow you to side load either way. That's a little more clear. So either way, you're not forced to use the Microsoft Store. It used to be you were forced to use the Microsoft Store for installation unless you told your user, open up settings, go to Update and Security, go to For Developers, and check the Sideload Apps radio button. And that just wasn't happening. All right? This is one of the things that held UWP back, in my opinion, is the fact that you had to go through the Microsoft Store. Well, there's so many scenarios where you don't want that to happen. Maybe you're just an enterprise application and you want to deploy in your enterprise. Maybe you're a small developer that just wants to give it to a client. Okay? There's a lot of reasons why you might not want to go through the store. With that in mind, Microsoft has now allowed that. All right, one last thing I want to show you, just for an example. What I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a new instance of Visual Studio. Give me a second here. And I'm going to create a new UWP application. There we go. And I'll create a blank Universal Windows application. This is what you would create if you didn't have that wizard that I walked you through. We'll hit next. Let's call it app 6 is fine. It's going to ask you for your target and minimum version. Cool. And once it does, it'll create for us a blank application. I just want to show you this to kind of show you the difference that you get. All right, so here's our application. And we have assets, which are a bunch of logos or other things for our application. And that's essentially the icons that would be for the tile and in the system tray and those kind of things. And then we have our main page, which is just a blank page like you'd have in a WPF application, and our app.xaml. That's it. And so this is where you might sit here and go, how do I get started? Well, that's where that wizard allows you to see what you could do, and then you can come back down to this page or this application and modify it in order to have those features that you wanted. So again, I encourage you, start with this wizard. Start with creating a application that has the pieces that you want. Don't try and build it as a real application. Just kind of scaffold out the different pieces that you want, and then create a brand new application and take what you've learned over in this project and transfer it over. Okay, so you've learned how to do some setup, and for example, in our app XAML, let's open this up, and we'll see. Okay, there's a resource dictionary and how we set that up, and how I merge that in, and those kind of things. You find out how to do all this setup work. Okay, there's some setup work for our Caliburn Micro. So there's some stuff in here with our containers and container registry, dependency injection, that's all set up for us. And with all this, you can take these examples and take just what you need and then create your application based upon that and have it be fresh and clean, and yet follow the examples that were created in that test project. And that's really my encouragement to you, is definitely create multiple test projects to learn this. Don't just watch what I did and assume that you know how to create a UWP application, or don't just use the wizard and not really understand what it's doing, but just say, okay, I'm going to use the wizard and create my application. Because it just won't be what you need, and it will end up being a little more confusing and actually cause you some problems in the long run. The way to learn is to actually build this out yourself. Okay? Now, there's some things I haven't covered. In fact, I pretty much haven't covered anything, it feels like, when it comes to UWP, because there's so much stuff here when it comes to deployment and putting it in the store and MSIX installations and certificates and all the rest, that there's a lot yet to cover. But I can't cover it in one video. This is just to get you started. Just start building it. Don't worry about deploying. Just worry about getting started and using it if you feel that this is a good option for your business, okay, or your learning path. All right, so just get started on that, and then we'll go into more detail in future videos. One of the ones that's coming up soon is going to be on MSIX files and how to create that installer, not just for UWP applications, but also for WPF applications and for WinForm applications. So we'll get into that in a little bit. But we'll continue to add more to this topic. But I just want to get you started using this and really understand how to use that extension. Again, extensions. And here, there is the Windows Template Studio. Use that to get started and give you some great examples of doing the design correctly and having that starter to work from instead of starting from a blank slate. All right, thanks for watching. And as always, I am Tim Corey.